this. Once described as the ugliest man in England is John Wilkes, radical, journalist and politician of the mid to late 18th century. Elected a member of Parliament for the first time in 1757, he spent a large part of the time between then and his death 40 years later, making a thorough nuisance of himself. Wilkes was every government's nightmare, pushing Magna Carta's freedoms to the limit, a mocking presence at the crossroads where law and dissent collide. Today, Wilkes is not nearly as famous as he deserves to be. An internet search is more likely to turn up someone named after him, John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. But if we're seeking answers to why Magna Carta grew far beyond its original remit, we can do worse than look at the life of this man. For it was Wilkes who forced the England of his day to face up to issues that still vex us and which go to the heart of the freedoms enshrined in the Great Charter. All right. What are the proper limits of dissent and freedom of speech? Should government be allowed to gag someone just because their views may be unwelcome, immoral, or inflammatory? Does law derive from an objective standard, or is it just what people choose to make it? These things matter just as much to us as to our forebears. They're the essence of whether we live in a dictatorship or a democracy. Wilkes was born in this district, Clerkenwell, in 1727, the son of a distiller. Capable of great charm, he also had a darker side. He wouldn't want to have been on the receiving end of his lacerating wit. Yet his public stances were usually brave, principled, and right.
I beseech you to consider this, that the more set apart we are for God and his service.
In an age when nonconformists and Roman Catholics routinely faced discrimination in public life, Wilkes argued for religious tolerance. He supported the American colonists' grievances as the government increased their taxes to help pay for recent wars against indigenous tribes and the French. He played a large part in compelling government to let printers publish the full texts of parliamentary debates, giving us the precursors of Hansard's parliamentary reports. Years ahead of his time, scorning vested interests and corrupt practices, in 1776 he presented the very first bill for reform of Parliament.
There are those who have doubted the need for the bill which I now bring before you. Some who say that our present system is an ornament to the nation and that to tinker with it borders on sacrilege. I therefore wish to explain why I have thought the present bill necessary. The plain fact, sir, is this. To base the franchise on private property is a monstrous absurdity in a free state, as well as an insult to common sense.
These prints by Wilkes' contemporary William Hogarth show why change was needed. They were inspired by the 1754 election, which saw unprecedented levels of bribery and corruption, and depict blatant attempts to buy votes. A man fingers an IOU. A woman counts her treat money, whilst her husband merrily takes bribes, and attempts are made to extract votes from the feeble-minded. This was a system where small electorates in so-called rotten or pocket boroughs made a mockery of democracy and were wide open to fraud. Wilkes' campaign for legislation to tackle these problems would have struck a chord a century before he lived and a century afterwards.
Honourable Member for Ellsbury.
Mr. Speaker, I wish, sir, an English Parliament to speak the free, unbiased sense of the body of the English people. The meanest mechanic, the poorest peasant and day labourer has important rights respecting his personal liberty, that of his wife and children, and his property, however inconsiderable. Yes. Without a true representation of the Commons, our Constitution is essentially defective. Yes. Parliament is a delusive name, a mere phantom. I therefore flatter myself that I shall have the concurrence of the House with the motion that I now have the honour of making, that leave be given to bring in a bill for the just and equal representation of the people of England in Parliament.
We could be forgiven a sense of déjà vu. The words might almost have been spoken by the soldiers who appeared before Cromwell during the army debates. It's a reminder that Magna Carta didn't suddenly spring into being out of nowhere. It was self-consciously based on another charter, one issued by Henry I over a century earlier, which had promised to restore the laws of the last Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor. Laws which led in a direct line back to those of the greatest of all the Saxon kings, Alfred. Saxon legal codes had made explicit the fact that the law applied to all, even the king. By placing the ruler under the same constraints as everyone else, they carried within them the promise of rights for the common man, and thus the germ of democracy. Wittingly or not, Wilkes tapped into this legacy. He appealed to people outside the small circle that dominated the politics of his day, to small traders, to artisans, to clerks, to the common people. He was a pop star politician in an age of outward conformity and often stultifying deference. And he was at the epicenter of a series of events that shook the establishment and changed the country forever. He first came to widespread notice through his irreverent, controversial, and, truth be told, downright scurrilous weekly broadsheet, The North Briton. Broadsheets were an early form of newspaper, part of an information revolution that made governments of all stripes nervous, for they threatened official control of news and could easily be channels for sedition. Literacy was nowhere near universal. It rose from perhaps 30% in 1640 to about double that by 1800. But broadsheets had a huge influence because people would read them out to friends and neighbours. And with a circulation of almost 2,000, the North Briton sold close on 8 times as many copies as its government-friendly rivals. To those in power, the North Briton was gutted journalism, pure and simple. Muckraking and invective were its stock in trade, since Wilkes was one of those people who didn't seem to care whose toes he stepped on. As far as the authorities were concerned, even the broadsheet's title was gratuitously offensive, which was precisely its intention. It was a tongue-in-cheek reference to the King's chief minister, Lord Bute, a Scotsman, who Wilkes attacked, amongst other things, for his supposed Jacobite sympathies. In other words, for being a supporter of the Stuarts. That was definitely below the belt. The last reigning Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, had died childless in 1714. Since only Protestant rulers were acceptable in that day and age, all Roman Catholic claimants to the throne were then deliberately passed over. Instead, the crown had been offered to George, Elector of Hanover in northern Germany. He'd not even set foot in England and never learned much English. But no matter, a new dynasty was installed. By the time issue 45 of the North Britain was published, his great-grandson George III sat on the throne. But the Hanoverians remained insecure in the extreme about their position, and with good reason. Wilkes was picking at one of the raw wounds of contemporary society. Almost half a century might have passed since last the Stuart ruled. But in their Scottish homeland, many still clung to hopes of their restoration. There was a continuing and heavy-handed crackdown on Highland clans following the 1715 and 1745 Jacobite uprisings. Two doomed attempts to put a Stuart back on the throne. For decades after these existential threats to the House of Hanover, it was only necessary to mention Scotland, the king over the water, or even 15 or 45. And in the mind of a jittery officialdom, the thought, threat to national security, was not far behind. The result was that government's response to any perceived slight was all too often hysterical overreaction, repression, or petty spitefulness. One of its more outlandish ideas was to redesignate Scotland North Britain, hence the title Wilkes chose for his broadsheet.
When issue number 45 of the North Britain came around, with its echoes of the 45 rebellion, Wilkes obviously thought that something really special was called for. After months of sniping at the government, its policies and its ministers, this time he surpassed himself. Published on St. George's Day, 23rd April 1763, this issue directly accused the government of lying. For good measure, Wilkes also implied that it would be a sacrilege for the king to attend a Thanksgiving service here at St. Paul's Cathedral. An outraged establishment threw the book at him.
Wilkes was no paragon. He's widely thought to have been a frequent visitor to this former Cistercian priory at Magna on the Thames just outside Henley. It was owned by Sir Francis Dashwood, who used it to host a group of high-born or well-connected rigs called the Hellfire Club.
Parodying Christianity, they styled themselves the Monks of Magna. Their motto was, "Do as you will," and their meetings must have been quite something. There were rumours of debauchery and other dark goings-on, perhaps even devil worship. It's said that at one of these gatherings, Wilkes caused uproar by releasing a baboon, which he dressed in a cape and horns. Now, whether or not any of this was true, there was clearly plenty of ammunition for the authorities to throw at Wilkes. In earlier ages or in other countries, he wouldn't have stood a hope.
Yet the powers that be had reckoned without their feisty opponent. Here he is awaiting trial, sketched by William Hogarth. Wilkes holds a placard with his slogan Liberty, and 2 issues of the North Briton which especially offended the king, numbers 17 and 45, lie beside him. He looks supremely confident, and with good reason. For the circumstances of his arrest were questionable in the extreme. The warrant hadn't mentioned anyone by name, but had simply authorised a search for the authors, printers and publishers of the offending broadsheet. Alongside Wilkes, a total of 48 others had been arrested on this one warrant. Competent and possessed of self-assurance bordering on arrogance, Wilkes was not cowed. It was as though he treated it all as a game. Asked by a Frenchman how far freedom of the press really went in Britain, he said to have replied, "I cannot tell, but I'm trying to find out." There was no doubt he had the gift of the gab, and he knew it. Making light of his ugliness, he used to boast that it took him only half an hour to talk away his face. This way with words stood Wilkes in good stead at his trial.
Silence. All rise. The Crown versus John Wilkes. Court in session.
He denied the legality of the warrant on which he'd been arrested with such vigour that he was acquitted of all charges.
May it please your lordship, the case before you concerns a broadsheet of some repute. I might say, ill repute, called the North Briton, of which the accused is the alter ego and presiding genius, to which he is the chief, nay, the only contributor.
In the process, the court decided that parliamentary privilege protected him from a charge of libel. To add insult to his enemy's injuries, he was also awarded a large sum in damages from the Secretary of State who'd issued the warrant. From that point onwards, general warrants were illegal.
Wilkes was cock-a-hoop. He'd struck a famous blow for liberty. Bute had resigned, and the streets were filled with supporters chanting, "Wilkes! Liberty! Number 45! His escapades were even set to music, with a ballad entitled Wilkes and Liberty, a new song.
But his triumph was short-lived. In November of that same year, Wilkes was challenged to a duel by Samuel Martin, a former secretary to the Treasury and an ardent supporter of George III. Enraged by his mockery of the king, Martin taunted Wilkes for being a stabber in the dark, a cowardly and malignant scoundrel.
Mr. Martin?
Mr. Wilkes? Wilkes, who prided himself on his sense of honour, couldn't let that pass. So one morning, the pair faced off against each other in Hyde Park, with their seconds at their side.
Begin.
When each man's first shot missed, they declined to treat honour as being satisfied and prepared to fire again. Whatever else Wilkes might be accused of, he was no coward. This time, Martin did not miss.
He's hit!
No. The fourth shot wounded Wilkes in the stomach, though as it turned out, not fatally.
But, rat!
Meanwhile, the government had found another ground on which to charge him. this time for having an obscene poem published with footnotes which Wilkes attributed to a bishop. Ironic that this archetypal anti-establishment figure should now have a statue in the heart of London. There's even a street named after him. In the days when he was a thorn in the government's side, it was very different.
On the point of being expelled from Parliament and charged with impious libel, with no defence and friends thin on the ground, Wilkes fled to Paris, where opponents of the English regime could usually be assured of a sympathetic reception. Tried in his absence, he was declared an outlaw on 19th January 1764. Wilkes stayed in Paris for 4 years, living it up as best he could, until the demands of creditors forced his return. This time, surely, there was no way out. But there had been a sea change in England in the years since William and Mary had come to the throne. One of the most far-reaching effects of the Glorious Revolution was its removal of the Crown's unfettered control over judicial appointments. The inevitable result was a judiciary much less willing to toe the government line.
However fallen,
And just to make sure that there was no repeat of the abuses under Charles II's brother James, the Bill of Rights of 1689 had denied government's right to suspend the execution of laws without the consent of Parliament. Magna Carta's promise of free and impartial justice was starting to look as though it might become a reality. The new spirit on the bench was personified by this man, Lord Chief Justice William Murray, Lord Mansfield. Fiercely intelligent, morally upright, a staunch defender of freedom and judicial independence.
the prosecution argued forcefully.
It was Mansfield who presided over Wilkes' appeal against the sentence of outlawry. And he didn't like what he heard from the government's lawyers, brushing aside prosecution claims that Wilkes was a danger to public order in no-nonsense style.
We must not regard political consequences, however formidable they may be. If rebellion were the certain consequence, we would be bound to say, Justitia fiat ruat coelum. Let justice be done, though the sky fall. Find the accused or guilty.
Mansfield came down firmly on the side of freedom of speech and the rights of the individual. The sentence of outlawry was set aside, though as it happened, Wilkes still served a short jail term on other charges. This is Westminster Hall, built by William the Conqueror's son, William Rufus. It's the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster. Around this huge space, with its magnificent hammer-beam roof, grew many of the defining institutions of the state, including Parliament, government offices, and law courts. Amongst the legal cases heard here were the trial of Charles I and some of the many pieces of litigation involving John Wilkes. So it makes a fitting backdrop to reflect on the wider significance, not just of the 18th century radical, but of the whole legacy that he was fighting to defend. For in large measure, it was through the courts that the finer details of that political experiment, which had started with Magna Carta, been fought over in the Civil War and then cemented by the Glorious Revolution, began to be fleshed out. Magna Carta had had some vital things to say about law. It had made the king promise that justice would not be sold to the highest bidder, and the right to trial by jury was entrenched. These provisions underpinned the development of a genuine rule of law in succeeding centuries. And juries didn't only help protect the subject against an overmighty state, they also implicitly recognized that the people's consent was needed if law were to command not just obedience, but respect. So what Magna Carta said about law had an impact on politics too. This is one of the four inns of court, where those who will go on to become judges have traditionally trained and plied their trade as barristers.
English law's respect for and reliance on precedent automatically brings with it a deep sense of connection to the past, to the so-called common law, which first developed under the circuit judges of Henry I in the 11th century, but whose instincts and reflexes owe much to the Anglo-Saxon world. It was the Saxon love of freedom, of a voice for the common man, of equality before the law, to which the parliamentary soldiers had looked after their victory over Charles I, as they sought to explain what they'd been fighting for and how those ideals should be reflected in the future governance of the nation. Their understanding of these things was idealized, of course, but idealized or not, their roots go deep. The Roman historian Tacitus had noted the Germanic tribes' democratic folk assemblies, their egalitarian merit-based societies, their disdain for authoritarian leadership, and the respect which they gave to the opinions of women.
These Saxon ideals were the underlying springs from which the common law drew its vigour, springs which flowed with force under the favourable conditions brought about by the extraordinary experiment in government that was now underway. After the Glorious Revolution, judges were deliberately paid huge salaries. That was to make sure that they couldn't be bought by anyone, not even the king. They were to be one of the first lines of defence against any attempt by the crown to roll back the settlement that had been agreed when William and Mary accepted the throne. In the following years, the judiciary kept their side of the bargain, proving redoubtable defenders of freedom. Justice, blindfolded as she weighs evidence in the balance and wields the sword of truth.
Today, we think it self-evident that the law should treat those who come before it impartially. But Charles I and Charles II claimed the right to hire and fire judges at will, hardly guaranteed to produce an independent judiciary.
The question we need to ask ourselves is not just how we got from there to where we are now, but why. Why was a habitual troublemaker like Wilkes not just put in prison to rot? He would have been in many other times and places. Why did Magna Carta prove to be more than just words on a page? Why did revolution in England, first the Civil War and Commonwealth, then the Glorious Revolution, not collapse into bloodshed and dictatorship like the French Revolution? Why did judges champion the individual against an overmighty state, instead of serving as agents of repression? Lord Mansfield's career helps answer those questions.
It has been argued before me that this case is a simple matter of movable property.
In 1772, he handed down one of the landmark judgments of English law concerning the status of a black slave who'd been brought to England. Just as he'd once dismissed government scaremongering over John Wilkes, Mansfield batted away arguments that a slave was nothing but a chattel to be disposed of at a master's whim.
I do not hold to that view. Slavery is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Every man who comes to England is entitled to the protection of English law, whatever oppression he may hitherto have suffered, and whatever be the color of his skin, whether it is black or it is white. English law does not recognize the institution of slavery. This man shall go free.
The effect was that any slave who set foot on English soil, and there were plenty of them, as Hogarth's works show, was immediately free. This judgment flew in the face of all accepted convention. It came 35 years before William Wilberforce and his fellow campaigners began to stir the conscience of the nation about slavery, and by some reckonings led to as many as 15,000 being released from human bondage. Mansfield's abhorrence of slavery and love of liberty were consistent themes. And the source of the moral imperative that inspired his groundbreaking judgments was clear. As he put it in another case,
The eternal principles of natural religion are part of the common law. Essential principles of revealed religion are part of the common law. English law is Christian law.
Mansfield was making an extraordinary claim for English law. Not only was it above the king and his government, Magna Carta had made that point, but there were times when it might even be above the people, above Parliament in other words, because ultimately it looked to a divine and not a human standard.
Here, my liege.
Just what that means might easily be lost on us unless we stop to consider it carefully. For, unlike the version enshrined in the American Declaration of Independence, the English political settlement didn't rest on we the people, but acknowledged a higher divine authority. By asserting the traditional freedoms of the English Church and upholding its right to elect bishops without royal interference, the very first clause of Magna Carta had entrenched this view deep within the fabric of the nation. And by quite deliberately looking back to Saxon times, the Charter went even further. The introduction to King Alfred's Law Code had listed the Ten Commandments and other Old Testament laws, making an explicit connection to God's law. Consequently, what Lord Mansfield had to say wasn't a minority view. Time and again, judges remarked on the key role of Christian ethics in English law. Mansfield's contemporary, judge and legal theorist William Blackstone, for example, wrote that any law that is contrary to the scripture is no law at all, and not to be obeyed. The idea of law, having an objective standard derived from the Bible and independent of any human agenda, wasn't everybody's cup of tea, of course. Across the Channel, a very different set of ideas was beginning to take root, which would lead in a very different direction. One of the prime movers in the new thinking was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Born in Geneva in 1712, he later moved to Paris and embarked on a career as a writer and composer. His ideas were to have a profound effect, not only in France, but further afield. Rousseau believed that man had been corrupted by civilization. In 1762, he published his groundbreaking book of political theory, The Social Contract. In one of its most memorable phrases, he asserted,
"L'homme est né libre, et partout, il est dans les fers."
Rousseau argued that people should free themselves from the false constraints which society placed on them, something he showed himself only too happy to do. Even though he advocated child-centered learning, he sent his own children to be raised in a foundling hospital. Many accused him of heartlessness and hypocrisy, though doubtless Rousseau would have replied with his famous quip,
Les insultes sont les arguments de ceux qui n'ont pas d'arguments.
Whatever the circumstances of his private life, Rousseau's ideas proved to be electrifying. They opened up the possibility of a whole new order, doing away with reactionary regimes and their self-serving laws and giving power and freedom to the oppressed at last. The Social Contract made Rousseau a celebrity. Just 4 years after it was published, he was invited to England, staying in Derbyshire, where, in the fashion of the day, he spent much of his time communing with nature. Though he lived a rather reclusive life, he was widely admired. One of the few who was not impressed was the famous intellectual Dr. Johnson, who commented,
"I think him one of the worst of men, a rascal who ought to be hunted out of society. He's a very bad man. I would sooner sign a sentence for his transportation than of any felon who has gone from the Old Bailey."
But regardless of what his detractors thought, Rousseau had hit on something. The question was, once the old had been done away with, what was to replace it? Building on the concept of man as a noble savage, reluctant to submit to authority, Rousseau cast around for a legitimate authority to which those who had been newly liberated could submit. He concluded that there was only one, the people, and what he termed the general will. The impact of this insight was cataclysmic. And it was France which felt its full force. There, the common people, especially in the countryside, endured dreadful conditions. Government was utterly corrupt. Power was concentrated in the hands of the king and the nobles, with no effective checks on how it was exercised. The upper classes paid no taxes at all, so the tax burden fell disproportionately on those least able to bear it. The national finances were in a hopeless mess. In this environment, Rousseau's talk of the natural rights of man and general will of the people were seized on hungrily. They seemed at last to offer relief from oppression. New ideas helped spread contempt for convention and organized religion, undermining habits and institutions which in previous generations had encouraged the poor to acquiesce in their lot. The stage was set for what was to come. spark which lit the powder keg was the storming of the Bastille by a mob on 14th July 1789. In the upheavals that followed, the king was made a prisoner. Now, the revolutionaries suddenly found themselves with a chance to put theory into practice. Their first step was to write a new constitution, and to get that process underway, on 26th August 1789, the National Constituent Assembly approved an historic document. It was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And the very first article made its debt to Rousseau plain.
Les hommes naissent et demeureront libres et égaux en droit. Les distinctions sociales ne peuvent être fondées que sur l'utilité commune.
In other ways too, the Declaration adopted Rousseau's ideas and took them to their logical conclusion.
La loi est l'expression de la volonté générale. Nul ne doit être inquiété pour ses opinions, même religieuses, pourvu que leurs manifestations ne troublent pas l'ordre public établi par la loi. La propriété étant un droit inviolable et sacré, nul ne peut en être privé, si ce n'est lorsque la nécessité publique légalement constatée l'exige évidemment.
It all sounded wonderful. Surely no one could take issue with this. And so at first it seemed. There were howls of outrage from some, of course, because of the harsh treatment meted out to the French king and nobles. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man was warmly received in many quarters in England, and not only by what might have been thought the usual suspects. In July 1789, the House of Commons even proposed a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the revolution.
Yet one man in particular was notable for his lack of enthusiasm. Irishman Edmund Burke, a veteran MP who had first entered Parliament almost a quarter of a century beforehand, was one of the few to see right from the start what dangers lurked in it. He was no knee-jerk reactionary, and, like Wilkes, had been a champion of the American colonists in their dispute with the mother country. But he was no fool either.
Burke's analysis was clinical and his warnings prescient. For, if law is the expression of the general will, it follows that its moral content is irrelevant. So law can override personal opinions if the general will determines that these disturb the public order, and can do away with property rights if there is public necessity. Under this scheme of things, there is in fact no freedom of conscience, and all the supposed protections of the law are worthless. Just as Burke had predicted, the high hopes and elevated ideals which had accompanied the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen were soon lost in an orgy of bloodshed. In 1793, the new republic created a Committee of Public Safety under one-time lawyer Maximilien François Isidore de Robespierre, and France was engulfed by what became known as the Terror. Burke had seen that the wording of the Declaration was the language of oppression hiding behind a cloak of righteousness. The contrast with Magna Carta couldn't have been starker. The preamble to the Charter had twice referred to its being put in place for the improvement of our kingdom. This emphasised that power was not merely for the king to use as he pleased, but was to be wielded for the common good. And the Charter's frequent references to God underlined the fact that kings were answerable to a divine standard, not just human expediency and what they thought they could get away with. The general will of the people knew no such restraint. Having no concept of accountability, it lacked the means to encourage good government and restrain bad rulers. Indeed, it struggled to articulate a workable theory for why people should obey their rulers at all, and when they were entitled to disobey. The opposition to King John and to Charles I had not just been a matter of self-interest, but was motivated by powerful ideas of what was right and just. In Rousseau's Brave New World, it looked like there wasn't much beyond brute force. Rousseau died on 2nd July 1778, too soon to see how his ideas were to shape not just France, but the entire world. His concepts spawned totalitarian regimes which eagerly embraced the idea that law is what we choose to make it, and its moral content is neither here nor there. But this viewpoint is alien to the traditional common law of England. It runs completely counter to the ethos of Magna Carta and is a world away from everything that Lord Mansfield stood for and believed in. Mansfield's vision was part of the same worldview that Wilkes was fighting for. The famous radical captured the imagination of people who normally had little or no interest in politics and certainly had no time for arcane rules of law and procedure. He was able to do so not just because of his larger-than-life personality, but because his fight was, in a sense, their fight. Wilkes' body lies here. In later life, he became respectable. He was a London magistrate during widespread rioting in 1780, and when an old woman in the crowd spotted him, she called out,
Wilkes and liberty!
Quiet, old fool! That was all over long ago!
but it is as a radical that he deserves to be remembered. As the man who made sure that no one could be arrested on a general warrant. As a bold defender of freedom of speech. As the one whose actions ensured that the right to sue for false arrest was strengthened and clarified. Wilkes' story matters for the present because it tells us something deeply important about where we've come from and where we've been headed until the recent past. It points up the contrast between Magna Carta and the alternative.
Wilkes and Lord Mansfield showed one way in which a society can approach law and dissent. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen and the things that flow from it showed another. For all the noble sentiments of that document, as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, it began to look increasingly as though England had got the better bargain.